Hello and welcome back to the Publisher Podcast from Media Voices. I'm Esther Thorpe, and this season Chris Sutcliffe, Peter Houston and I are exploring the people and products powering publishing, both through the podcast and our adjacent weekly newsletter, which you can sign up for at voices.media. This season of the Publisher Podcast is sponsored by BlueConic, your all-in-one customer data solution. Go from data to insights to action with BlueConic's fully integrated customer data operations system. Learn more at blueconic.com, where data is for doing. Now this week we're joined by Daniel Smith, Managing Director of the Mark Allen Group's Agriculture Division, which includes brands like Farmers Weekly, Pig World and Poultry Business. His team are behind the Farmers Weekly podcast, which was shortlisted in the Best B2B Podcast category at the Publisher Podcast Awards this year. I was really struck when reading their entry about how smart they'd been monetising what is quite a niche podcast topic and audience. So we discussed creating a podcast that would fit into a farmer's lifestyle, where the podcast fits in terms of subscriber acquisition and engagement, and collaborating with sponsors to create a saleable proposition. I also learned about the fittest farmer competition. I started by asking him what the Farmers Weekly world looks like.
So Farmers Weekly has been, we celebrated our 90th birthday this year, and it started as a weekly farming publication. We're still a weekly magazine. We've got 23,000 subscribers. We still sell 10,000 copies, give or take, on the newsstand every week.
I feel like that's a lot of farmers.
That's a lot of farmers. Yeah, it's a lot of farmers. We've got our website has got 600,000 users a month. So clearly that's not all farmers, but there's enough content on there that it does attract an audience of people that are interested in what happens in some stories in the farming community. We've got a couple of apps. We do the podcast. We do events, awards, conferences, everything with kind of British agriculture and farmers, especially at the heart of what we produce.
And I guess that must have been there must have been a lot of people coming to you around the Brexit fallout, because there was a lot of changes in the farming industry then, right?
There was, yeah. And probably the single biggest change for farmers was that government support and the subsidy that most farmers were in receipt of, which used to be based relatively simply on a common agricultural policy of how much land you farmed. You were paid a subsidy for the amount of land that you farmed on. That, over the course of 7 years, and we're sort of 3 or 4 years into that now, is being phased out towards what they call environmental land management schemes, and farmers are then rewarded now or subsidised for the environmental impacts that they're having on their farms, as opposed to just the amount of land that they're farming. So that's things like growing wildflowers in in the margins of your fields, and improving biodiversity on your farm, environmental sustainability impacts that you can have on your farm business. So it's for many farmers, that's quite a fundamental shift in what was traditionally quite a large part of a proportion of their income. So it's a very, very challenging period of time for most farmers at the moment, for sure.
I'd love to get into that, but I'm conscious we're not a farming podcast. So I'm going to try and stick to the media business side of it.
And then you would definitely need someone who isn't me talking more about farming, for sure.
Well, yeah, I was wondering why the farmer behind our field had just left like a corner of it just for sort of, I mean, it's supposed to be wildflowers, it's definitely brambles, but yeah, that explains that.
Exactly, yeah.
The podcast is, it's a couple of years old. When you were looking at launching it, what were some of the sort of things you took into consideration in terms of like the audience and the proposition?
So for us, it was it had been on the roadmap for a little while, and like with any business, it's trying to prioritize the 101 other things that are going on at any one point to then think about what's new. And actually, we ended up launching very, very shortly after COVID lockdowns kicked in. So that was by design, I suppose, with that, if you can call it good luck, that was the timing was right in many respects, because obviously everything was locked down. So then that access to information became much more important for everybody. And And so we brought forward the launch of the podcast. And I should give credit to the two people in our business, one on the commercial side, Tom, and Johan, our editorial host, if you like, that were the two champions behind it. And I think that's been certainly a learning for us, is that you've got to have people that really, really want to do it to make it successful. And certainly without their enthusiasm, we wouldn't have got it off the ground in the way that we did. I'm almost certain of that. And so farming by its nature is a pretty remote job, and a lot of individuals spend a lot of time on their own or in very, very small teams doing tasks, 24/7 on some farms. And so the appetite for switching off and turning a podcast on, we always thought there was a good appetite for that in our community. And fortunately, it turned out that way. Again, I think timing wise, we were able to benefit from the sort of explosion, if you like, of podcasts at that time as well. But we've grown, and it's got a really consistent audience of listeners now. So we've been very pleased with how it's gone.
So I've got a picture in my head that this is very stereotypic aimed at the farmer and his tractor, that he can have something to listen to while he's ploughing the field. Is that right? Yeah,
pretty much. Yeah, and it's exactly that. So sitting in the tractor cab, dairy farmers in their parlour for the morning milking, literally walking the crops. People will be out with their agronomists and checking up on their crops. There's all sorts of tasks during the day where put your headphones in and listen to a podcast. You've got a captive audience.
So where does the podcast sit as part of your product portfolio in terms of, is it mainly to drive subscriptions, or is it to sort of build that relationship with existing subscribers? Like, do you have that picture in mind before you launched that?
Initially, it was much more of an extension for subscribers and that kind of retention of audience who engage with Farmers Weekly in a way that they couldn't before. So when you want a piece of information or you've got 5 minutes, it's very unlikely that you've got the rolled up copy of Farmers Weekly in your back pocket. And even, visiting the website is not really a common practice for most people now. So we wanted to be able to give people access to the same information, just presented in a different, more easily consumed way. And that's kind of how it's played out so far for us. I think it's always hard to know exactly who the audience is, but we certainly have seen a good kind of retention of those kind of weekly, monthly listeners. The format is very, very kind of magazine led, if you like. There's a number of features and finally, and a bit of interaction between the hosts, which I think is one of the things that our audience like the most, is when you get that bit of comment and opinion on what's happening as much as the news or the feature itself.
Yeah. Is the format something you've ever looked to change up, or has that been very set from the start?
It was a bit of experimentation at the start, and until we sort of found our feet, and then it's been pretty set since then. We are actually at the moment we've been through a bit of a review to try and shake it up and give it a bit of a refreshed look. One of our hosts, co-host Hugh Broom, who was a farmer, is a farmer himself. He got too busy with other things, so he stepped back from it at the end of last year, and so since the beginning of this year, we've got a new co-host in. We've been experimenting with more of our staff internally taking part in the podcast as well. And so at this stage, we're looking at a slight kind of tweak to the format, which just makes it a bit sharper for the listener, and in some respects a bit simpler to produce as well, because it's quite a weighty. The way we've done it to this point, it's been quite a weighty production process, which can make it a bit onerous in some instances.
You said that it had been launched as a bit of a sort of side project. But then you're saying about the fact that, farmers aren't taking the magazine in their pockets, they're not necessarily visiting the website. Can you see a scenario where the podcast would actually end up being much more at the centre of the brand as sort of maybe that first touch point or the primary touch point that the audience reaches Farmers Weekly through?
That's a good question, and an interesting thought. I'm not sure. I don't think it would be. I think one of the opportunities that we have, being the brand that we are, is that people are very familiar with Farmers Weekly. And I think if you asked 100 people, you'd probably still get 90 that would say it's a magazine. And that's part of the challenge we've got, is to try and change help our audience understand that the value of a subscription to Farmers Weekly is in the content and the tools and the access to information that you have, and not necessarily in the physical product or the website or the app. It's all of those things. And if we can help farmers to improve their business, improve their margin, address problems that they have on their farm, we don't really mind how they interact with us, so long as they do. So the podcast, when we launched, it was another route to giving people access to that information. And the comment about the magazine folded up in the pocket is clearly that's not the case. There's a different use case for people that will sit down and make time to read the magazine versus those that have got 5 minutes between tasks on a farm, or are going to be in their tractor cab all day. So we need to make sure that our product is available however, wherever, whenever our audience want access to it. And that's been a big part of our overall strategy of engagement with our audience, of which the podcast plays its part.
When you first launched it, and I guess probably I'd be interested to know if these have evolved as the years have gone on, did you have sort of goals or KPIs around listener numbers or anything like that? Or was it very much just see how it goes and then maybe set goals further down the line?
Now, this is where I should say we had a real clear set of KPIs and objectives and numbers that we were going for. We didn't in terms of specific targets, and we had an idea, because obviously there are, if you look at DEFRA numbers and the people that used to get subsidies, there are something akin to 120,000 farmers in the UK. But that includes everyone that's got a small holding, and if you've got a couple of chickens, right? But so there are probably, we would say maybe there's between 30 and 40,000 farming businesses they're in farming to be farming businesses, to be profitable, to continue farming for the long term. And I guess that's, from Farmers Weekly's perspective, that's very much who we target in terms of how can we help you to improve your business. Now, that's not to say that we don't address the other farmers that don't have that kind of long term or the appetite to change in the way that they'll need to change. But that's kind of where that's our main focus, if you like, because that's the longer term future of farming. Is if you don't do those things, it's going to be very difficult to continue to be a profitable business in farming. So we had an idea of what our addressable market was, if you like, but really no idea until we launched as to how many people would really engage. But just I think we reached our millionth download a couple of months ago on the podcast. It was almost perfect, but not quite aligned to our 90th birthday, where we got our download. So it would have been a nice story to tell. But it's shortly after that, I think we reached our millionth download. So I think what we have certainly learned is, whilst we started in mind with it being another way to engage for our audience, we've certainly attracted another audience of people who, they're in farming, they're interested in farming, but perhaps they might not be a subscriber yet. They might never be a subscriber, but what they get from the podcast is interesting and valuable enough that they continue to be a listener. So again, from our commercial perspective, for our sponsors and partners that take part in the podcast itself, there's value to that audience, even if they're not subscribers to Farmers Weekly at the moment.
Yeah, I'll definitely get into commercials in a second, but I guess that's the advantage of being a B2B podcast, isn't it? That the people that are listening are going to have to be really interested in the farming industry. Like, it's not something just a casual passerby is going to sort of think, oh, I'll have a listen to the Farmers Weekly podcast.
Yeah, it's funny because I think Farmers Weekly probably straddles. We're definitely we're a B2B publication, but a lot of those businesses are family oriented farm businesses. So, you might have 2 or 3 different generations working on the farm business, but these are all farming people. They're interested in what happens, even if they're not playing an active role in the farm, on the farm itself. So we do get, and that's what I said, the website gets 600,000 visitors. But if we cover a piece on Jeremy Clarkson, which is is pertinent to and for farmers, there's obviously a lot of public interest in that as well. So whilst it's interesting and we get traffic from that, it's not necessarily they're not our core audience, if you like. It's not who we're producing that content for. So yeah, I guess if you're listening to the Farmers Weekly podcast on any sort of frequency, you have to have some sort of interest and knowledge about farming for sure.
Yeah. I'd love to do a bit of a dive into the sort of commercial side of things, because I think one of the things a lot of publishers struggle with is putting value on their podcast offering, especially if it's a relatively new launch. But you've said you've had quite good revenue growth. There's quite a sponsor appetite for it. How have you gone about packaging up that podcast to take it out to market?
So we sort of tried a few different things initially, and we were very fortunate in some respects that some of our kind of more key customers, bigger accounts that interact with us on a number of different projects and initiatives and advertising opportunities, were brought alongside the launch of the podcast at the time. So we kind of included them from the outset of what we were trying to do, why we were doing it, and we had some early adopters that supported it from the outset. And I said, take it back to Tom, our senior sales guy, who was really driving that when we launched. So when we did launch, we did have some commercial support, and we kind of worked with those 2 or 3 sponsors to really define what that proposition needed to look like to make it valuable for them. And where we landed was a kind of schedule of, it feels very common now, and I think it was at the time really, but you sponsor a series of podcasts. So you had a 6-week period of sponsorship, and within that 6 weeks you would have a number of different lengths of ad within the podcast episode itself, and we'd run 2 or 3 sponsors concurrently in each episode, and one would have a 1-minute advert and the others would only have sort of 20 seconds, and we'd plug them in. And that has worked well for a certain type of customer that are they're maybe more familiar with they've got marketing teams, they've got they're able to sort of schedule ads and get people involved in recording an advert for a podcast, albeit it was still reasonably new to our audience, I think, or our advertisers to do something like that. One of the challenges we've had certainly is that kind of production or the perception of production of ads for a podcast. So those customers that don't necessarily have the teams behind them maybe, or the people that within those businesses that really want to do something like that and record an advert, it's been more difficult to engage those types of customers. So we've tried to work hard to provide our own support to those sorts of sponsors by having a reasonably basic in-house production offering to those types of sponsors. And again, that's worked pretty well in terms of trying to make it an easier purchase for our sponsors than maybe it was when we first started. And our team, we're again part of the Mark Allen group. We're very fortunate to have a brilliant production team who can support some of those customers. And then the commercial model is tweaked as a result of that. So if they get production support, we can charge a little bit more for that, and it makes it a slightly easier purchase. That's been a real learning curve for us, for sure.
Do you do those instead of host-read ads, which is what I think a fair chunk of other people do?
Yeah, we haven't really been down that road yet. That is part of the kind of the reformatting, if you like, of the podcast itself, and a kind of a shuffle round in options for sponsorship. Again, I think we were quite protective of it. It's comparatively quite a small industry. So, if at the time, our view was, the host, Johan, reading out an advert for Massey Ferguson tractors, we didn't feel that at the time would be the right thing for us to do whilst we were building up the podcast and what it stood for. I think, if anything, that sort of advertising now on podcasts has obviously become much, much more commonplace for the audience. Most importantly, that they'll know, they know what they're listening to. They know that it's an advert, it's sponsored. So that is the next kind of iteration of that sponsorship offering will include some host-read advertising. I think we'll still maintain real editorial control over. There might be some sort of sponsors or advertising that we wouldn't want to do that with, but that's again the benefit of our sales team selling direct, is that we can kind of target the businesses that might want to do it, that we'd feel comfortable having.
Yeah. So you've got the ads, the produced ads. Do you do any sort of sponsored series or sponsored episodes that are sort of more one-offs separate to the weekly podcast?
Yeah. It's been a bit more aligned to projects or events or topics that we've covered editorially separately to the weekly podcast. So we've run a series of events, Farmers Weekly Question Time, which familiar with the format. It's very simple. It's a very well attended event, but we record all of those as sort of special podcast episodes. So that's a very different kind of interaction to the sort of maybe 30-40 minute weekly news-led format, to an hour, maybe an hour and a half in some cases, of sort of Q&A. It's just a recorded version, but they do still get a lot of engagement, which I find quite incredible, really, because it's quite a long listen, and obviously the nature of Question Time is that it's quite, you can go anywhere, anything can happen. You don't really know what you listen to. And then we've done things on location where, so we do an event called Britain's Fittest Farmer, which is, again, kind of does what it says on the tin, but it celebrates both sort of physical and mental well-being within the community. Again, a really big topic, big issue actually in farming. Again, mentioned that sort of isolationism and the pressure that farmers are under. So we do specials when we do events like that. We've got a project called Transition, which is, again, kind of linked to that transition that farmers are having to make away from area-based payments to more environmental schemes. So we support a number of farmers that are on a different part of their journey towards transitioning away from that, that area-based payment. And that includes a number of farm walks we go on, and we'll turn those into podcast episodes as well as part of that project. So it's part of other things we do, but it's a bit more sporadic, so that we don't necessarily have a schedule so much of those sorts of things, and they become part of the Transition project or Britain's Fittest Farmer.
I didn't know that was a thing, and I'm delighted to learn today that is a thing. I'll be looking that up afterwards.
It's great. Yeah, it gets a lot of interaction for sure.
I know one of the issues a lot of publishers face when they're looking at advertising, and I know a lot will go down the programmatic route, is that the value that's placed on a podcast audience for programmatic is really low. Like, I think you get anything between like 5 and maybe, well, if you're lucky, sort of £10 to £15 per 1,000 listens, which is, for a B2B audience, like a disgustingly low rate.
Yeah.
When you're taking the podcast out to sponsors and saying, this is the number of listeners we get, how do you kind of put a value on that audience to try and almost break that cycle of like, you're not getting, 1,000 listeners for 15 quid?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's, again, sort of the learning curve that we've been on in trying to demonstrate the value to our sponsors and tell the story around why they should consider doing it. Where we get a lot of success is trying to think about the the frequency of interaction with a brand. So we might have 5,000 downloads of a week per episode, but we know that a certain proportion of those listeners are listening every week. They're really engaged. They're listening to the whole episode. So we try to use those metrics to build up a story that that frequency of interaction with your brand is much more likely to give you an outcome, a positive outcome, when that person, that listener, comes to make their next purchasing decision. Because if you use the example of Massey Ferguson, tractor manufacturer, huge tractor manufacturer, big customer of ours, making a purchase of a tractor is not a quick decision. It's a big lofty investment in many cases. So it's not a very transactional decision that's being made. So for those types of businesses, having multiple touch points, viewability, listenability, if that's even a word, of the interaction with the brand being front and center. So when that next decision needs to be made on machinery, that it's their brand that's thought of. But it's not, they're not easy conversations to have, because you're trying to convince a partner to part with thousands of pounds to sponsor 6 episodes of the podcast, and trying to define what that value is back to them. In many respects, it's a similar challenge to what we have across our sort of display led advertising anyway, right? It's where's my money best spent, and what am I going to get back from it? The reality of many of our customers who are selling services and products that are complex decisions to make, you're not going to get, very unlikely to get an immediate return of someone saying, "Oh, I heard your ad on the podcast," and
the 20% discount code, it might cut it for mattresses, but it's not going to cut it for a tractor.
Exactly. But that's the flip side of that coin, and where we are now is maybe trying to target some of those businesses where the purchasing decision is much less complex. It's a lower value transaction. It's an easier purchase for a farmer to make, but creating a value proposition where the podcast is a viable route to accessing that sort of audience, that just opens up another segment of our advertisers to potentially come and sponsor the podcast.
I suppose the last question I want to ask is, what would your advice be for other publishers who might have B2B podcasts or podcasts in quite niche verticals in terms of building that loyalty with audiences and advertisers?
From an advertising perspective, I think, as I said, we were very fortunate that, targeted in the fact that we went to our best customers, the ones we've got the strongest relationships with, and kind of took a collaborative approach to launching the podcast. We wanted it to work for them, so we let them have some sort of input in the discussion of what should that sponsorship package look like. And I think that has really helped with those customers, and with us then creating a proposition that is saleable and got some flexibility as we approach other businesses. That was a big benefit to us, and certainly making it simple as you possibly can to purchase, and trying to overcome that production or lack of production expertise as is potentially seen. One of the things that is really important in our market anyway, and I'm sure it's similar in others, is that actually it doesn't need to be perfect. The authenticity of having someone from that business talking about a product or a service that they offer, there's a familiarity with that in our market, and people are much more inclined to engage with something that's really authentic than something that's perfectly produced and polished. So that was quite a learning curve for us, because you sort of think it needs to be great, it needs to be perfect, but it really doesn't. And then from an audience perspective, I think, like all podcasts, I think the hosts are really important, and that chemistry that you have between hosts, that we are, in most weeks, we're presenting you information that you can find at Farmers Weekly, whether that's you go to the magazine or the website or the app. But what you can't get anywhere else in the format that we present it in the podcast is that communication between our hosts and the opinion and the disagreements and just that you can't convey on a page, whether it's a web page or a printed page. And I think most of our audience really, really subscribe to that interaction and that way of receiving information.
So what's next? Are you looking at video podcasts, AI podcasts?
All of the above. Yeah, I think, again, what we want to try and think of experimenting with is maybe more podcasts, but more focused sort of subject matters, shorter, sharper, daily interactions that you can have with that type of content. I think the weekly podcast itself will always be the mainstay, the kind of flagship. I think that's what people are now familiar with, but we want to experiment with doing things that are maybe a bit more targeted at, certain segments of our audience, and just give people other touch points throughout a week rather than just waiting for the weekly podcast.
Thanks so much to Daniel for speaking to us. Now, don't forget, we've got a write-up of the key learnings from this interview on voices.media, or you can get that dropped into your inbox every Tuesday if you sign up to the publisher newsletter, also on voices.media. There's a nice little newsletter tab up the top. This season is sponsored by BlueConic, the operating system that puts data into action for marketing and growth doers. Their industry-first solution empowers doers with an unmatched range of capabilities to access relevant customer data, create resonant customer experiences, and drive maximum returns for their business. Learn more at blueconic.com, where data is for doing. We'll be back next week with another dive into the people and products powering publishing's future. Until then, you can keep up with all things Media Voices by following us on LinkedIn and subscribing to the publisher newsletter over on voices.media. See you then! Oh, hi! So if you're still listening to this, good on you for getting past the outro music without skipping. Well, it's either that or you're waiting patiently for your next podcast to start and you've got me again instead. Anyway, as a 10 out of 10 listener, I wanted to give you the first opportunity to RSVP to our Christmas party and live podcast recording, which we're holding on November the 27th in London. It's called Pod in a Pub, of course it is. So Chris, Peter and I will be taking a look at the last 12 months in media and publishing. Come and join us for festive food, drinks and chat. But here's the thing, we only have 25 spaces in the room. So if you'd like to grab one of those before we publicise this next week, you can go to voices.media/podinapub. That's voices.media/podinapub. And I really hope to see you there in person. And thanks for listening to the end.